Hello and welcome back to the Joyful Soul Creates. Lady Joyful here, and today I have a 10 cards 1 kit video to share with you using the Simon Says Stamp February 2018 card kit, which is A Colorful Crafty Life. For my first card I'm going to do some watercolouring. I have a piece of Tim Holtz watercolour paper and I'm white heat embossing a sentiment from the Crafty Friend stamp set onto the paper for some emboss resist, and then I'm also stamping on the paint tube using my favourite things, black licorice hybrid ink, which is waterproof as well as being alcohol ink friendly. I'm then using the Daniel Smith watercolour palette that came in the kit to paint my splash of colour from the paint tube. There, I started out with the red ink, red paint, and then I just gradually added colours so that it would kind of change and be a gradient of sorts going across the page, the panel. I'm adding a gradient into the colour space on the paint tube as well, so that it kind of coordinates. And then I felt like the sentiment wasn't standing out quite as much as I wanted, so I just went back in with a bit more pigment just behind the letters, just to help them stand out a bit more by having the deeper colour behind them. So here I'm adding some more of the yellow and green. I made sure to keep similar colours next to each other so that I wouldn't be having anything mixing to make muddy colours. And then once it was all painted, I adhered it to a slate grey card base, which completed the first card. My second card uses the tone-on-tone stamping, which is something I do quite a lot. If you've seen my other card videos or cards that I've put up on my blog, I like to make backgrounds with tone-on-tone stamping. So I use Altenew Lagoon ink on the AUDREY blue card to make this card base. And then I wanted to add the little scissor stamp, but I realised it was still attached to one of the other stamps, so I just snipped them apart carefully. Then I will stamp the scissors onto one of the cut lines, or stitched lines, whatever you want to think of it as. I'm again using the Lagoon Altenew ink for that, which works very nicely on this colour of cardstock. It goes very well with it. Then I'm using double-sided tape to adhere my orange circle in place, and I gutted the centre out of that just so that I could still use that bit later. I'm popping up the other piece of pattern paper with foam tape, and these pattern papers are from Echo Park's I'd Rather Be Crafting paper pad. Then I'm going to use one of the wooden embellishments, the little sewing machine, and I'm using some silver pigment ink to color it up. And I will use the craft tacky glue that came in the kit to stick the wooden embellishment into place. And I'll just add an acrylic block on top whilst it dries just to weight it down. For card number 3, I decided I would do some ink smooshing. I made myself a makeshift palette using just a page protector and some white card. And I have another piece of the Tim Holtz watercolour paper. I squished my Worn Lipstick Distress Oxide ink pad onto my palette, spritzed it with water, and now I'm just pressing the paper, the watercolour paper, into it. And I will use my heat gun just to dry in between layers. It doesn't need to be completely dry, just I don't want it to be completely wet in between each layer, and then I will just press it back in and keep picking up more of the ink and smooshing on more layers until I'm happy with it. And once that was done and once it was dry, I moved on to stamping on top of it, I placed it into my MISTI, and I'm going to add a sentiment, the paintbrush and the paint palette. I didn't want the whole sentiment, so I just used some washi tape to mask off the top and the bottom so it would just say hello. And because the paper is so textured, I had some difficulty with it stamping. I stamped 3 or 4 times, but it still wasn't getting the coverage I wanted. So I took a watercolor marker. These are MozArt, and just filled in all the areas to make them properly black. And then I'm using some glossy accents to adhere some of the Studio Katia CUPID'S crystals onto the paint palette. I then trimmed down the watercolor panel, and I'm stamping the diagonal stripes onto the bottom of my grey card base, so that will be showing from beneath the watercolor panel. And I adhered that panel to the card base using some double-sided tape, and then I'm adding some more of the crystals just scattered across the card, which completes that one. Number 4, card number 4, is a 1-layer card, and I'm using the, I'm going to create a pattern stamped across the card, and I'm using the pencil, pen and paintbrush stamps, and I'm inking them up so that one's yellow, one's orange and one is red using some Simon Says stamp inks. And I will just stamp them into place, and I rotate them each time, so some are vertical and some are horizontal, and I go about 3/4 of the way up the card with that. I then added my sentiment, and then I'm scoring for some extra interest. I'm scoring in between the pattern, not all the way across the card, just within the area of the pattern, which finishes number 4. Number 5 is also another very simple one. I'm using the burnt orange card, and I'm heat embossing the stripes and the hello sentiment onto it. I'm using gold embossing powder here, and then I will melt it with my heat tool, and here you can see as it melts, which is always fun to watch, especially with these metallic embossing powders. Once I'd completely heat set it, I decided I would add 3 little hearts. I felt it just needed something extra, and I'm using ink pad lids as my stamp blocks for this because I don't have small acrylic blocks, and these work as an alternative. So that's number 5. Number 6, I'm using another of the wooden embellishments. This time I'm using some bronze pigment ink to colour it up. The bronze was quite dry, so it took a little while for me to get the colour on it, and even then it's not as intense a colour as the silver one was. I adhered it to a piece of vellum. I felt it looked better that way. I didn't like it when you could clearly see through it, so I thought the vellum helped. Then I used some double-sided tape to adhere my pattern papers down. I'm using the camera pattern paper and then a panel of the wood pattern paper to the top and bottom of that. And then just trimming off the overhanging edges from the card base. Then I'm trimming around the vellum that I had adhered to the back of the wooden embellishment, just so that there's no overhanging pieces anymore. I decided at this point that I wanted to add a sentiment to the bottom of the card, so I'm using the thanks sentiment, and I'm gold heat embossing that so that it will stand out from the background nicely. And then I'm again using the tacky glue to adhere the wooden camera into place. I will use my T-square ruler to make sure that it's nice and straight on the card base. And that's the end of card number 6. Card number 7 uses lots of the pattern paper. I trimmed all of these bits down off screen just for quickness, and you can see what my layout is going to be like here. So I'm stamping the sentiment onto some of the orange paper, and all this stamping is using my favourite things, black licorice hybrid ink, which is just my go-to black ink. I seem to end up using it for everything. And then I'll stamp each of the little stamps, the paint palette, the paintbrush and paint tube, onto their little pattern paper squares. And it was quickest to do all 3 of them at once. So then I adhered the pattern paper squares to their matting squares, which was the same orange as the sentiment strip. And I'm again using my T-square ruler to help me line everything up on the card. Everything is adhered into place using double-sided tape. And I'm using the little scissors to cut off the overhang. These were the Plus Twiggy curved blade scissors. And then I adhered that to the card base, which finished number 7. So for number 8, I'm again using the thanks sentiment, and I gold embossed it on black, and then I'm carefully fussy cutting it out, which it's relatively simple to cut out. The circles are an easy enough shape to cut around. I'm using 2 more of the wooden embellishments, the scissors and the thread spool, which I coated with gold pigment ink this time. And then I have die cut 3 circles of pattern paper, the orange paper, and I'm attaching them to my burnt orange card base. I'm going to pop up the sentiment using some black foam squares, and using my T-square ruler to make sure that I get that lined up straight across the card base. I actually still managed to get it wonky, but I did adjust it off screen afterwards. And then I'm using the tacky glue to adhere the wooden embellishments into their circles. And I will again place acrylic blocks on top just to hold them in place whilst they dry. Card number 9, I'm using up some snippets. I'm first white embossing the thanks onto this blue snippets of paper, and I will heat set that, and actually it didn't quite stamp properly, so I'm re-stamping it, and I will do it again. Luckily I'd left the sentiment in the stamp in the MISTI, so I could just stamp over it again and redo it. So then I will trim it down. I used the scissors and also my craft knife to try and get it completely straight, and I still ended up wonky, but it's close enough. So here you can see me just trying to work out, trying to use the lines on my mat to get it completely straight. Then I'll trim it off with my craft knife. Once I had it trimmed down, I adhered it to a snippet of the brown wood grain pattern paper. That will be my mat, and I'm using the Twiggy scissors to trim around it. Then I covered my card base with double-sided tape, and I'm starting to adhere all the papers into place. I put the side panel down first, and then the larger panel, and then I have a very narrow strip of the wood grain paper, so I'm using my glue pen along that, and then I'll use my reverse tweezers just to help me lift it up and get it into place. Again, I'm using my T-square ruler to help make sure I get it completely straight, and being a liquid glue I can shift it slightly before it dries. And then I add the little sentiment panel, and that completes card number 9. My final card, card number 10, I used some pink paper directly on my card base to cover the whole card base. I then took the kind of scrapbooking pattern paper and matted it onto the darker pink paper. I fussy cut one of the cameras from the camera pattern paper, adhered that to a embossed circle of vellum and stuck that down onto the card, which completed number 10. Thank you for watching today's video. Here are a couple more that you may enjoy. You can click here to subscribe and never miss a video, and the like button is below. I look forward to hearing from you in the comments as well as over on social media and my blog. Happy crafting, and I'll see you again in the next video. Bye!